Good evening and welcome to our fifth session of the virtual Deertrails Naturalist Program. My name is Diana Stenberg and I'm TLC's Deputy Executive Director. Our Deertrails Naturalist Program was first launched in 2019 in the Clearwater River Valley, where TLC protects more than 140 acres of meadow, wetlands, and forests. The program was designed to provide opportunities for the transfer of naturalist knowledge between generations. Our volunteer instructor sharing with us tonight is Maleea Acker. Maleea Acker is the author of two poetry collections, The Reflecting Pool and Airproof Green, and the nonfiction book Gardens Aflame, Garry Oak Meadows in BC's South Coast. She has 20 years of experience as a writer, journalist, and teacher, creating materials that allow both children and adults to learn more about nature and culture. As a freelance journalist, she thrives on work that helps to nurture natural history and cultural heritage, from the translation of science into story. She teaches human geography and Canadian studies at the University of Victoria and holds a PhD in geopoetics. Welcome, Maleea.
The book that I'm going to be talking about and reading from a little bit, and which has the research that I'll be discussing tonight, is called Gardens Aflame, Garry Oak Meadows of BC's South Coast. It came out originally in 2012, I believe, with New Star Press, and then there was a second edition that just came out last year, which was nice that it stayed in print. So as far as I know, it's the only kind of layman's guide to this particular ecosystem on the south coast of Vancouver Island. And in its attempt to kind of cover not just the species and some of the characteristics of a Garry Oak meadow, but also the restoration efforts that are happening in it. And then some of the philosophy behind why we consider these places so important now and why they were so important in the past for First Nations. And what needs to be done to continue to protect what's left, which is very, very little, as I'll talk about. So I just wanted to show you the cover before I start the slideshow. So I'll just share my screen here. And before I get started, I just want to do a territory acknowledgement saying that I am on the traditional territories of the Wasanich, the Lekwungen, Songhees, Esquimalt nations. I'm a settler here, and I'm very grateful to be an uninvited guest in these lands. My parents came from Eastern Europe, specifically from Lithuania, Poland, and from Ukraine. So I haven't gotten a lot of sleep the last couple of weeks. They arrived through Ellis Island and from California and Detroit and Winnipeg and ended up here in this absolutely magic spot. And I'm so thankful to all of the nations that live here on the coast for the stewardship that they have done over thousands of years and the way that they've cultivated this particular landscape into something that is unlike anywhere else in the world, I think. So I want to talk tonight a little bit about a lot of different things. I guess the trajectory that led me to write this book and some of the spin-offs from it that have developed in my own yard in terms of restoration and cultivation of native species. Some of the philosophy behind why I think we're in so much trouble these days in terms of our connection to the natural world. And why I think gardens, in particular native plant gardens, are so important for us to consider and to take part in. And then I'll give you a few examples of some of the restoration that's gone on on the South Coast, and read a little bit actually from the book at a couple of points, and then end with the story of my own meadow in my own yard, which is kind of hilarious, considering that the municipalities around here are supposed to be very supportive of native species and people growing them. Took quite a while to convince them that what I was doing was okay, but I'll get into that later. So I wanted to just start by talking about an idea that Tim Lilburn brought up with me several years ago when I was at a residency program with him called In the Field. And he said that settlers who had come to North America it never really landed on the ground where they ended up. They'd always been living about 4 feet off the ground, and they never really attached themselves to the earth, right? And so, you know, they came, they brought the old country with them. They brought that nostalgia of the old birds and the old seeds and the old traditions, and they had a really hard time seeing where they were and what was already here and what was working. And so they did things like, you know, turn up the shortgrass and tallgrass prairie ecosystems that had roots so deep that when they were cut, it actually sounded like a gunshot, and just replaced everything without really realizing what was here. And he said, until we land, and until we learned how to be here as if it's a home and as if it's our home, we're not going to be able to connect with things. We're not going to be able to have the relationship that we need to have. So I think, to me, I see that as one of my main responsibilities as a settler, is to figure out how to live in the world as if I'm at home, and particularly live in this particular place, this ecosystem, and figure it out and connect to it and understand both its beauty and its function and its place. And I think that's how we're going to kind of work ourselves back into some sort of harmony with the natural world, and a realization that we're not separate from it, that we're just one of many species. So that's the kind of overarching idea that I want you to start with when thinking about this particular meadow ecosystem. This is Camas and sea blush that you see in the photo here. It's two of the primary species that you see in a deep soil meadow in the early spring, well, mid-spring, around anywhere from mid-April to mid-June. And yeah, this is what they look like in the spring. Garry meadows are very particular to the south coast of Vancouver Island. There are 2 spots on the mainland, I believe, around Camas, where there are small patches of them. But other than that, in Canada, the only place they appear is on the southern Gulf Islands and on the southern part of Vancouver Island. And they're very particular in terms of what kinds of species they have. They have some of the highest biodiversity of any terrestrial ecosystem in BC, over 700 species of plants, tons and tons of insects, hundreds of insects, very biodiverse, and a very particular set of species that inhabit these places. And as you can see, they look very much like Old England, right? Like with the bluebells, except they're not bluebells, they're native camas. So when Sir James Douglas landed here in 1850 something, he said, it's like a pleasure ground. You know, it's like this Eden just dropped from the clouds into this place, and I don't understand how this is possible here. Of course, what he was failing to see was that this whole area, this whole ecosystem was managed by First Nations, and the only reason that it existed in the first place was because of the annual burning and the cultivation and spreading and thinning of all of the plants, and the burning of the meadows that happened on a yearly basis by First Nations. They were matriarchally managed, and people had family plots, and that was the way that they kept the secession ecosystem, which would have been the Douglas fir trees, from moving in at the edges, and the rest of things like snowberry and the higher bushes that would have crowded out the flowers. And the reason they wanted these open spaces was because Camas was a primary carbohydrate source for the First Nations on the coast here. They traded them all the way down to California. And when you cook them in pit cooks, they taste a little bit like a baked pear or an onion, kind of a sweet onion. And they're really, really rich. They travel well, they store well. So they were part of the richness of this South Coast place. And one of the reasons why there are some stories that people who lived here thousands of years ago, First Nations, had to work maybe 12 hours a week, and the rest of the time was used for art and cultural development and ceremony and lots of other stuff that didn't involve having to do a 9-to-5 shift. So lots and lots of abundance. Salmon was a big part of that, but Camas was a big part of it too. So these are pictures from Uplands Park, which is one of the last deep soil Garry meadows that's still semi-intact in the Victoria area. There are some shallow sites that are on upland sites like Mount Tolmie or Playfair Park or a couple other spots, but this is one of the only deep soil ones. And this was part of an original subdivision by Frederick Olmsted, who was the guy who did he did Central Park in New York. And he created this whole subdivision in the Uplands, and then he ran out of money. And that's the only reason that this area, which was the rockiest of the whole neighborhood, didn't get developed into massive rich people's houses, and instead was able to be turned into park. And that's the reason we have these spaces now. And it's quite a beautiful, beautiful place. And as you can see, the deep soil meadows are really, they were the first to be taken over by colonizers because they have this rich black soil that's developed ever since the Ice Age left, that is a lot of non-acidic detritus just falling and falling and falling each year and building up the soil into something very black and rich and fertile. And the upland sites where the soil is thinner and it's more rocky, you get much smaller trees and less flowers. But in these deep soil places, you get just a plethora of species happening. And of course, when Vancouver arrived and Sir James Douglas, these were the first sites to be turned into farms and into housing tracts for the arriving colonists, because it was very arable, fertile soil. So that's also why there's very little bit left. This is an example of one of the upland sites. This is in Mount Suhalem in the Cowichan Valley. So you're looking down into the valley there. And you can see that with a slope like this and a much thinner layer of soil, you get shorter grasses. The growing season is much shorter because there's less water. The oaks are smaller, but still a very gorgeous, gorgeous place. So just back to this one again. And I just want to read you a small bit from the book. This is from The Lost Art of Seeing. And I think this is really key to think about when we're considering these meadows, because I have to admit, I come from a non-scientific background. So my thinking is from aesthetics, from philosophy, from trying to figure out why people find these places so beautiful and why they find them important. Because I think that's as important as what species are collected there. Robert Pogue Harrison argues that our civilization's gardens, and indeed the whole visible world, are being lost to us because our ability to apprehend the world has been curtailed by the effects of modern life. We live at a frenzied pace. Our lives, largely based in the virtual, leave little room for the time needed to experience gardens as they were originally designed, places of self-discovery, of spiritual cultivation, of personal transformation. Without the space and time to see a Garry Oak meadow or a garden's depths, it cannot unfold its appearances for the viewer. Time and its subjective and objective correlates is the invisible element in which gardens come to bloom. So for me, restoration and the people who work in these meadows and who appreciate the aesthetic qualities of the meadow as well as the historical importance of them represents some of the reasons that these places have continued to exist and are so important. Because when people work in these places, they care for them, they develop attachments to them, they sink down into place, and they have a better chance of actually landing, like Tim Wilburn was saying, on the ground and forming a connection with place. So as part of the research for the book, one of the first places I went to was Trial Island, which is just off the coast of Oak Bay. It's one of the last still operating lighthouses, staffed lighthouse. And it's, when the current isn't running, it's literally a 5-minute rowboat across the channel, but the current is running most of the time. And so it's quite cut off. And it's also a place where you're not invited to land unless you're asked. So it's not a place where people come and just walk around. Because of that, it's maintained a real sense of otherworldliness and difference from the rest of the kind of South Island. Matt Fairbairns, who I went out there with, called it the Salish Sea Riviera, because often when it's cloudy and rainy in the rest of the peninsula, it's sunny and quite warm there, but also very, very windy. And so the island is flattened all the time by these hard winds, and even the trees grow to the northeast in direction and kind of sweep over like that. Nothing grows higher than 10 or 15 feet. But it has a lot of really profoundly unusual rare species that can't really be found anywhere else on the South Island because of overtrampling and development and just loss of habitat. So bear's foot sanicle is one. This plant takes up to 20 years to bloom, and then it blooms once and then dies. And one of the major problems that's happening on trial right now, other than invasive species, is or invasive species of plants, is an invasive species of bird, the Canadian goose, which likes to nibble off the flower heads as soon as it blooms. So I came over there with a restoration team, and we were working in 2 hollows, removing ivy from large patches so that the resurgence of the native plants that were underneath could happen. They both remove invasives. They also plant natives, and Matt actually comes back and does a little bit of herbicide on the left stems of the ivy that are still there. And it's had a profound effect. You can see this is one of the places that used to be covered in broom. And that all of the leaves you see there are Camas that are just about to bloom. So it's had quite a profound effect on the ecosystem there. And it's interesting to see how something that's just that little bit removed and doesn't have the foot traffic of normal population really still has a chance to thrive the way that things mostly aren't thriving on the South Island anymore. This is another example of some of the restoration that's going on. So this is Mill Hill Regional Park. I believe there's something like 86 tons of biomass, invasive biomass, have been removed from the park so far. Broom, ivy, gorse. It's all done by volunteers through pulling together and through volunteers with the CRD. And because of that, they've seen a doubling of the species diversity and occasions of rare species in the area, which is really cool to see. So they actually take the giant biomass piles away by helicopter, and then they load them into big trucks. I don't know where they go, probably Heartland. But it's nice to see this kind of thing happening, because it's one of the success stories that it gives me a little bit of hope despite all of the developments that's happening in this area, especially in the last 10 years. So another really interesting one is the Bluebird Reintroduction Project, which started out on San Juan Island back in about 2001, 2002. And when I got there, it had been going on for a few years, and they were releasing translocated pairs of bluebirds, and then counting the nestlings, counting the adult pairs that returned, and trying to get enough habitat together that it would support species a kind of resurgence in the area. And as far as I know, I can't actually see the notes from my slides when I'm in this. But it's been fairly successful, and they now had, I believe, 86 returning pairs, well, 86 birds altogether, and a whole bunch of singles. And then the clutches had an average of about 6 nestlings per nest, and that was in 2021. So a bluebird, the western bluebird, which had been extirpated from the area for a good 60 years, has been brought back and seems to have a chance at becoming a normal part of the ecosystem again. So this is San Juan Island. In this map, you can see some of the reasons why these bluebirds would have disappeared over the last century. The green areas show you where deep soil and shallow soil Garry oak sites would have been. And then the pink is where they are today. So this is historic, and then this is what's left. So you can see it's shrunk quite a lot. And then this is Courtney, Campbell River, Hornby Island. So there's, I believe that's Halliwell Park out there. So tiny little bits left, but a lot of this has been trampled from foot traffic. And then this is the southern part of Vancouver Island itself, where the green represents the original extent of the Garry oak ecosystem. There were over 15,000 hectares of deep soil ecosystems, and now there's less than 150 left. And I would think that those were 2006 numbers. And a lot of that was out here in Langford and over here, and it's gone now. I will show you a map. So these red areas are some of the only places where they still exist. That's Uplands Park, where I showed you pictures of before. So you can see that there's just been a huge blow to this ecosystem. Other things like large developments, such as the Channel Ridge development on Salt Spring Island, have also done a real number on these ecosystems. In some cases, even when development has been prevented over the course of long protests, it still ended up with large areas that were clear cut that then had large sections of broom move in as invasive species and then invasive grasses as a result. And so the ecosystem, even if it was left alone, would never return to what it was before. So this is what Channel Ridge looks like now. That's all broom and thistle and gorse and lots of other European species moving in. So yeah, I mean, the best thing is to not disturb it in the first place, because as soon as you have bare soil, this is what happens. It turns into a moonscape. So a little bit more dire stuff to talk about, and then I'll get on to more good stories. These polygons that I've drawn, they're just through Google Maps, and you'll see a lot of them look still like they're forested. A lot of this was open forest with arbutus and lots of wildflowers, so kind of a ecotone coming together of two ecosystems where you had a little bit of Douglas fir and a little bit of Garry oak happening. All the green that you see is gone now. It's been clear cut in the last year or two. And then this is becoming West Hills, so all of that is going as well. So this is what's been lost in the last 5 to 10 years. You can see it's an area that's about the same size as downtown Victoria. And that to me is absolutely tragic. This was Bear Mountain, where Spade Cave was on the top, that was blown up with dynamite by an ex-hockey player. Cheryl Bryce protested quite vehemently against that, along with a lot of other people. It was a sacred cave for First Nations. And he was quoted as saying, I don't care if there is a cave, and if there is, I'm going to blow it up and put a hotel on it. And that's exactly what he did. So, you know, when we talk about density in our communities and building up so that we don't have to build out in this stuff, that this is the result of those decisions not happening fast enough. This is one of the areas that I was at last summer. This is right on the corner of Atkins Road and the Island Highway. When the BC Liberals were leaving office right before the NDP got in again, they sold off a lot of the provincial capital commission lands that were meant to act as a buffer of tree line as you were coming down the highway from Duncan into Victoria. And because of that, all of that has been clear cut and developed. And so you have now house farms all along the side of the highway. And this is one of the most recent clear cuts to happen. You can see that back here, there were Douglas firs and Garry oaks mixed together. And here is kind of a rocky site with lots of Camas and other stuff like that. And it's doing fairly well before they ran over it. So I actually rescued a lot of this and pulled it out and put it into my boulevard. And I'll show you what it looks like a little bit. So Um, there's lots of bad stuff happening in this particular ecosystem and in this particular part of the world, but there's also lots of really beautiful stuff too. This is the late Patricia Boyle's garden in Gonzales Bay. She turned her entire verge and the public beach access part of her property into a Garry oak meadow. You can see columbine, western columbine, lots of tall camas, sea blush that's bigger than any sea blush I've ever seen. I don't know how she did it, but she was, her skills were coveted by all. And so lots of private gardeners are doing this kind of work, which I think is really interesting and important. And another one that I went to visit was Roberta McCarthy, who also lives in Oak Bay. And she moved into this house about 30 years ago. And the first spring, her husband was away. And so the lawn didn't get mowed. And all of a sudden, wave after wave after wave of wildflowers came up. And she had no idea that, and probably neither did anybody else, they would probably come up as leaves and then get cut down. And so ever since, she's demanded that her husband not mow the lawn in the spring. They mow it down once the seeds dry out. But she has a succession of fawn lilies and camas, and but she can do this, I think, in large part because her yard is fairly secluded and not visible to a lot of other people. Because one of the problems, I think, with this ecosystem is that people think it looks messy, and they think nature looks messy. And we are so used to the idea of a cultivated a yard that has been tamed and controlled. The grass is only so high, and there are picket fences, and there are trees in a row, and there isn't piles of stuff anywhere. And we have a very different idea of beauty from manicure mentality. Exactly. Let's see. Yes. If I had my druthers, I would outlaw lawns altogether, unless they were native. But yeah, it's really confusing to me. And I can read actually a passage from the book that talks a little bit about this. I don't have it. Yeah, I'm not going to find it. Okay, that's all right. I think we need to readjust our idea of what beautiful is and what beautiful is within an urban area. If people can only do this when their yards are sequestered and they don't get in trouble from their neighbors because their neighbors can't see this, we've got no hope. One of the most important things I think we can do in the face of the most recent IPCC report is to create refugia in our own yards, however big or small they might be, and provide habitats wherever we possibly can that is native to the place and thus more likely to survive. And particularly the Garry oak ecosystem, I think, because it is already adapted to drought in the summers, and it does most of its growing in terms of root systems over the winter. And so could survive longer droughts that we're expecting to have down here. Unless we start acting like gardeners who can rearrange our idea of what is beautiful and embrace this more wild, uncultivated sense of what a yard could look like, and provide habitat for other species, we're not going to survive this. We're just not. And so, one of my primary things is to try to convince people to do this work and why it is so important. These are just a couple of photos that I thought were interesting to show. This is Mount Zuhalem, where Dave Polster is doing, or was about 5 years ago, a project girding Douglas fir trees to increase the size of the Garry oak ecosystem and keep the firs from encroaching too much. And as you probably know, coastal Douglas fir ecosystems are also endangered on the South Island, so they themselves are not something you want to remove lightly. But his thought was that unless we take away some of these, eventually the whole area is going to get colonized with firs, and the ecosystem will change entirely and eventually disappear because it'll be shaded out by the large fir trees. So let me read a little bit more. This is from the Cowichan Preserve. To step into the Cowichan Garry Oak Preserve in September is to slip into a world of copper. Leaves of the oaks in the lower water table areas have already gone brown and gold. The grass is spun straw and the slanted light of late summer drifts through the canopy. Irving Banman has prepared the site before the arrival of 10 other volunteers, including participants from BC Parks, Parks Canada, and Nature Conservancy Canada. Kate Proctor and I drive up from Victoria. Proctor is completing her master's thesis using research plots on the preserve, studying responses to fire by the preserve's meadow plant species. We arrive just as the team has begun soaking the mowed perimeter of the first burn with fire hoses, which bring water from Lake Cowichan almost a kilometer away. The day is almost windless, sunny and warm, and the fall rains are predicted to begin tomorrow. Perfect conditions, in other words, for a meadow fire. Together with researcher Andrew McDougall of Guelph University, Banman has been key to restoring the natural process of fire to the Cowichan Preserve. He began burning the meadows using 1 meter square test patches in 1999. A wet plywood box was laid over a square of meadow, and the perimeter was soaked and then covered in wet blankets. Usually there was so much surrounding moisture that the test patches had to be burned entirely by tiger torch. With help from Oregon State University and a 5-year research project, municipal restrictions were lightened and the Conservancy began burning 5 meter square patches, and then by 2007, its first larger scale burns. And by 2019 or 20 actually, they came to burn 1.5 hectares of land, which I think is just amazing. Banman's trying to work up to burning a large portion of this preserve every spring. So during a burn, the surface and air temperature of a grass fire can reach hundreds of degrees, but the soil temperature may rise less than 1 degree, which is key to stimulating the growth of native plants. Burning also reduces the thatch that grasses build up over time, and it makes it easier for native wildflowers to get the sun and moisture they need. Banman's fire drifts out from its starting point in a calm semicircle, advancing up the slope against the wind at a few feet a minute. When it meets the edge of the mowed area, it peters out with a sizzle. Occasionally, a larger patch of orchard grass will send the flames high as 6 feet and speed the fire's progress. But mostly, there's a lovely calmness to both the fire's progression and to the group's management as they reinforce the perimeter with hoses and watch for drifting sparks. They talk and take photos, and Brian then smiles from the far side of the clearing, a wall of flame between him and the lens. Burned meadow grass falls beautifully as carbon in the same pattern as its windswept, pre-burned state. The black swirls and waves, almost immediately cool to the touch, will disintegrate under the first rain, leaving white ash, which will also disappear within a month beneath a bolt of new growth. Banman looks out over the blackened field. I'd like to work up to burning 1/10 of this land every year. We crouch down where a line of burned grass meets the unburned meadow. There, a shelf of perhaps 2 inches where gold falls away to black. Banman brushes away the carbon, and the living moss underneath it, green, moist, thriving, bends under his touch. So I just think this is so cool. I would love to see this happen in Victoria too, in places like Summit Park and in Uplands, and Beacon Hill particularly, where I've seen over the last 10 years, as the encroachment of invasive grasses has grown thicker and there isn't burning happening, the wildflower populations are really, really decreasing. You're not seeing those huge waves of blue that happen on Beacon Hill anymore. It's mostly just grass. And that's just been in the last 10, 15 years that I've been watching it. So we need to start doing this again and getting used to the idea that fire doesn't have to be destructive. So might have been at 7:45, so I'm good for time, I think, right? I want to just end by talking about my meadow. I started this book when I moved to this tiny little house. It's 700 square feet in a treeless area of Saanich. It's kind of the last farmland to get developed in the 1920s through 50s through 70s, just kept infilling and infilling. Sandwiched between Tillicum Mall and Uptown Mall, the Island Highway and Burnside Road and Tillicum Road. So it's very noisy. It's very working class. It's very mixed ethnicities. So it's a very interesting place to be, but it's also right on the border of what was a coastal Douglas fir zone and a Garry oak zone. There's Garry oaks at either end of the street and one block over, and then there's fir trees that are block the other direction. So I was right kind of in the middle of things. So I thought while I was writing this book that I better put my garden where my mouth was, so to speak, and see what was in my own yard and what I might be able to do with it. So I stopped mowing and you can see what happened. Things got quite tall. And I thought it looked really beautiful. It looked like rural Saanich, and I was quite excited until I got a bylaw infraction notice in the mail that said, either you cut your lawn or we're going to come and cut it for you. And instead of doing what they said, I called the local papers and told them my story, and I ended up on the front page of the Times Colonist the next morning. Gardener ticketed for going native. And I eventually got a hold of a bylaw officer, and he put my mind to rest a little bit and said, don't worry, we're not going to cut it down right away. We're going to come and talk to you first. And, if you're doing something that really is restoration here, then we'll help you out. So I had this appointment where Adrian Pollard from Saanich was going to come and look, and the bylaw officer. And so I thought, oh shit, all I've done is like plant some little oaks and scattered some seeds, and I've just kind of seen what kind of grass is here. And of course, none of it's native. I better go and get going. So I took cuttings from rural Saanich, red osier dogwoods, Pacific ninebark, salmonberry, and you can see that they sprouted quite easily. So it's actually quite easy to get these things going. I also rescued more Camas plants from various places in Saanich where I belonged to the Saanich Native Plant Rescue Program, and various places in Langford and Souk. And then when they came over, they were actually okay with it. The biggest problem was my next door neighbor, which is the guy that's just beyond this hedge, or this fence over here. So I decided I would plant a hedgerow on both sides of the property so that people at the front who were passing on the sidewalk couldn't see eventually, and the people who lived there wouldn't have to look at it either, the unsightly long grass and the untamedness of it. So this is the second year of the native hedgerow, and you can see it really took off. I rescued some firs from a little rock face, and they're now about 20 feet tall. I've got a little oak that I planted in the midst of some of these Camas plots, where I would just dig out the grasses and then fill it in with nicer soil and put in the Camas. That's the little oak right here, you can see, and he's about 15 feet tall now. He goes right up the window there. So that's nice as well. And it just kept growing. So fawn lilies started popping up from some of the soil that I had transplanted from various restoration or rescue sites. And this is what it looks like now as you come up the front walk. There's an ocean spray that's landed of its own accord. There's mock orange, lots and lots of camas. There's a little bit of ornamentals in here too, but there's also bakmeen, which is bare stem desert parsley, lots of honeysuckle twining up through things. There's a shade garden with lots of oxalis and false lily of the valley, more ocean spray as you come up the walk. And I did a little bit of guerrilla gardening as well, where I planted some red osier dogwood on the other side of my fence, my neighbor's side, which has done quite well and now hides this backyard blue building. So I'm not beyond recommending that people plant things that it's where it's not their own property. This was what it looked like the first year that I started things out. This was by 2014. You can see the house is starting to get some privacy. You can see even spirea is developing here, which most of these are wetland or very moist plants, but I've somehow gotten them to thrive. I'm not sure if there's a seep under here, or I do have a soaker hose that I use about an hour a week, but it's not very much. So they've found something they like. And then this is what it looks like last spring. You can see the house has pretty much disappeared, and I now have to kind of hack it back every spring because it starts to grow over the sidewalk. And one of the most pleasurable things has been noticing the resurgence of wildlife that's happened because of this. This whole neighborhood was a desert, and still largely is. It thrives in growing dandelions and blonde grass and not much else. And so butterflies and dragonflies and all sorts of bees and birds. I've had lizards, both native and non-native. I don't have frogs yet, but I'm heading there. They all find this place, and I think that's quite spectacular that I can encourage that kind of stewardship. Oops, I'm going backwards. And so this is on the property side of things, but there's also a large boulevard that is part of where I live. And so last spring, when they were doing road work, they dug up the whole boulevard and a lot of the sidewalks. So I thought it was a perfect opportunity to redo that as well. And so what I've done is a complete restoration of the entire boulevard. It's about maybe 30 by 40 feet. It's quite a large boulevard. And a lot of these plants came from the site that I showed you at the corner of Atkins Road and the Island Highway, where they made absolutely no attempt to rescue native plants at all. So a lot of people came in and took a lot of stuff. And so you can see there's even shooting stars in here, and they're just coming up again now. So I'm really happy that they've made it through their first year. Tons of Camas, which really suffered the first year that I put them in, because we, of course, had to rescue this right at the height of spring. So it was not the right time to be taking that stuff out of the ground, but it's done incredibly well. And this was the first spring, actually, I seeded over as well. So you can see there's tons of sea blush coming up. And that did quite well. I'm waiting to see if that's going to come up again this spring. But yeah, it's, to me, it's about expansion wherever I possibly can to provide this kind of habitat. I do this in the whole front, and then the back has some native bushes and native trees, but it also has food for myself. So that's how I divvy it up, is 50% for me and at least 50% for nature. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say. Yeah, I think I've talked a lot about the restoration and the reasons that I'm doing this work. For me, I think, and for anybody who's thinking of doing it, it has a lot to do with connectivity to place, and then connectivity between parcels of native land that can provide habitat for lots of different species. It helps to bring this region back to a semblance of what its history was, and bring us back in contact with that natural world. Let us realize that we are just one species. We're not actually separate. And really, because it's what grows here best, and I think it's going to protect us better than cedar hedges will against the advent of climate change as it gets worse and worse here. It's just looking at a picture from last year in June. I snapped a screenshot of the temperature of 44 degrees that was projected for Vancouver Island at the end of June, and it reached at least that. And that's amazing. So anything that we can do, I think, to mitigate that and to provide habitats is something that will help save not just us, but everything. These are deltoid balsam roots flowers that I think they're more common in the interior. I remember Patrick Lane used to write about them, but they're only found in a few places. This is on Mount Suhalem. So I'll just stop the share there and if you have questions or yeah, just let me know. Thank you very much for listening.